If we're going to explain why the American Revolution happened when it happened, we should begin by looking at the aftermath of the French and Indian War. First of all, it's important to remember that the reason many colonists had fought in the war and supported the war was that they wanted land, especially in the Ohio River Valley. Uh, and after the war was won, many of the Native Americans who had been allied with the French protested when the French withdrew. They were not interested in withdrawing. They considered the land to be theirs. General Jeffrey Amherst, who was the British officer in charge of the area west of the Appalachian Mountains, especially in north of the Ohio River, mismanaged his job pretty badly. He was arrogant. He really didn't like Indians, and he cut off trade with them. He displeased them with his attitude and with his actions. And the result of that was Pontiac's Rebellion, which began right in the Detroit area. This was tremendously successful for a time. All but two British forts were overrun by Pontiac's forces. And this was very costly to the British Army, costly in terms of loss of life, but also costly financially. And this led to the Proclamation of 1763. If you look at this map here, this line, which more or less follows the Appalachian Mountains, separated the areas where the colonists were allowed to settle from this pink area here, west of the Appalachians. And the British attitude was that if you move into this area, this will create all sorts of conflict and all sorts of headaches and expense for us who are going to have to defend you. The American attitude was, wait a minute, we had just fought this war to get access to this area. And now that we've won, you want to deprive us of that. So both sides were very unhappy, and both sides had reason to be unhappy. Their points of view were entirely understandable. Now, Britain's finances were in terrible shape. The Prime Minister, George Grenville, was known as a competent money manager, and he took some steps which were intended to fix Britain's financial situation. In 1764, at his urging, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This actually cut the tariff or tax on sugar in half. The difference was, though, that the law was very strictly enforced, so that smuggling of sugar, which had been very common, was cut down by the British Navy. It was diminished drastically. So the control by Britain, the interference in colonial affairs, was especially unwelcome. A lot of the protests that preceded the revolution were not primarily about taxes, although they talked about taxes. They were about who made the decisions and how much the British government was going to intrude on the affairs of the colonists. They had enjoyed a good deal of freedom, and they didn't want to lose it. There were two laws passed by Parliament in 1765 that continued the trend of interference in the affairs of colonists, as the colonists saw it. The Quartering Act made colonial legislatures responsible for housing and provisioning British troops. The attitude of the Crown and Parliament was that these troops are here to protect you, and you ought to pay for them. And in fact, the tax burden in Britain was much higher than it was in the colonies. The average British citizen uh, in in the homeland was paying about 25 times as much in taxes as the average colonist. Um, Now, the Stamp Act was by far the more important of these two laws from 1765. It provided that any printed material had to carry a stamp, which was sold by the British government for a price. That included even newspapers, deeds, marriage licenses, all sorts of things. And this provoked an enormous reaction by the Americans. First of all, the Stamp Act Congress met in 1765 to discuss what to do about this. And at the Stamp Act Congress, maybe the most influential intellectual leader was James Otis, who contributed the phrase, no taxation without representation. And this was a principle that goes back all the way to the Magna Carta in some form in 1215. There's a long tradition in English law that Parliament should be the institution to levy taxes or to impose taxes. And this should not be done by the king because Parliament was representative of the people. But Americans could not vote for members of Parliament. So um, that's the origin of the phrase. They're against any taxes unless they had a vote in Parliament. Now, in response to the Stamp Act, groups sprang up in the colonies known as the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, and they used a lot of different methods to intimidate the stamp collectors, those who would actually collect the taxes, the fees for the stamps. Uh, they might pay a visit to them and say, you know, maybe you'd like to find another line of work. If that didn't work, they might burn the person in effigy. A dummy that looked very much like the stamp collector would be set up in the public square, town square, and burned. Sometimes it got to the point where their houses would be knocked down or they would be tarred and feathered. And this was quite effective because the British Army couldn't possibly police the vast territory of the colonies, every city, every town. Uh, so the Stamp Act was really not working very well. Now, Parliament responded the following year by repealing the Stamp Act. This could be taken as a sign of weakness, and they didn't want that to happen. So the same day, they passed something called the Declaratory Act, which basically said we can do anything we want. We have the authority. We'll make any decision we want to make. But to do this right on the heels of repealing the Stamp Act, I would argue projected not strength, but more weakness. The following year, they tried another approach. They put duties or tariffs, taxes, on imported goods like lead, paper, tea, paint, glass. And there are a couple of important points about this. First of all, they were not direct taxes. With the Stamp Act, average citizens would have to pay for these stamps. With tariffs, you wouldn't see the tax directly. Merchants would pay it. You would see it indirectly in higher prices for the goods. Um, but this indirect tax didn't fool many people. The colonists were unconvinced by it. What was ominous to them also is that British colonial officials were paid from these tariffs and not by the colonial legislatures as they had been in the past. Uh, there's a basic principle that you will be loyal to the person who pays your salary. And now the salary was not being paid by the colonial officials or legislatures. It was being paid by those under the control directly of the British Crown. There was a whole series of protests against the Townshend Acts. One of them turned into violence. On March 5th, 1770, uh, at a protest, British troops opened fire on some of the protesters. The first person to die was an African American, a former slave by the name of Crispus Attucks, who had been living in Boston and working as a sailor, as a merchant seaman. And after the Boston Massacre, the Parliament backed down on the Townsend duties, except on tea. Once again, uh, showing a sign of weakness and yet not wanting to project this image, so insisting that the tax on tea would remain. About this time, committees of correspondence developed. These were groups in the various colonies who would write letters to each other and keep each other informed. So you had movement in the direction of more cooperation among the colonies, which would become very important in the revolution itself. An image of the Boston Massacre, no way to know how accurate this is. There was a lull, but then 3 years later, the Tea Act was passed. The tax on tea was really very low. You would have had to drink a gallon of tea a day for a year before the tax would amount to $1. Uh, but there were other aspects of this that really rubbed the colonists the wrong way. Uh, the British East India Company was in trouble, and the act was passed to allow them to gain an advantage in selling tea to the colonies, dumping cheap tea on them, and that actually hurt the tea merchants in the British colonies in North America. So on that day, on December 16th, 1773, patriots disguised as Indians dumped tea into Boston Harbor. 15,000 pounds sterling worth of tea. The pound was the British unit of currency. This raised the level of conflict enormously because it provoked uh, a very, very strong response from Parliament. They called it the Coercive Acts. To coerce someone is to force them to do something. In the colonies, they were called the Intolerable Acts. Uh, they did a number of things. For example, they closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, and this had a large effect on all sorts of trade. Uh, they decided that private homes now could be used for quartering British troops. Earlier, it was up to the legislatures to provide uh, for the housing and food provisions of British troops, but now they reserve the English reserve the right to use private homes for that. And the legislatures were not in a position to do it because the Massachusetts legislature was suspended. The term for it is the general court. It's not a court of law. It's a legislature. And they were put out of business. There were town meetings that could be held only with the governor's consent. And the town meeting was a very long tradition in New England. And in fact, this is part of the background of the First Amendment to our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which guarantees freedom of assembly. This is what was being denied here. In Massachusetts, jurors were now chosen by sheriffs appointed by the Crown. And this meant that the English were trying to make sure that they would get convictions and not be able not to have to deal with the sympathy for protesters that so many residents of the colony would express. Not only that, but people accused of crimes could be taken to England for trial. And once again, this gives rise to a provision in the Bill of Rights in our Constitution that mandates that Trials must be held in the local area where the crime is said to have been committed.